Well, welcome everybody to our first evenings at the Homestead in over 2 years in person. It is good. It is good to see your faces. And I'm sorry to break up conversation. I know it's still novel for us to have such human interaction, but good to see you all. I'm Ryan Orgera, and I'm the CEO of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. And for those of you who are not familiar to us, you are here. This is SCCF property. We are responsible for, well, in part, I don't want to take all that credit, in protecting Sanibel and Captiva for the last 54 years. And we do so through education, water quality research, native plant nursery where you are here. And I encourage you to come back during the day if you haven't seen it. Education, communications, outreach, and we have about 37 employees currently and partnerships all up and down the state of Florida. And here today, we are here this evening to celebrate one of those very important partnerships with the University of Florida, more specifically the Center for Coastal Solutions. So welcome. SCCF has worked tirelessly to help protect over 2/3 of this island in permanent conservation. We are the largest private landowner. And over the course of the last several years, we've come to the conclusion that in order to be respectful to all the work that people have done in protecting this incredible place and fighting for the ideal that is Sanibel, it's important that we look outward to protect our islands from external threats. One of those is, of course, water quality. We're all acutely aware of what that is to our economy, to our society here on these islands. But additionally, there are other external threats that we are turning our attention to, including climate change and sea level rise and increased storminess generally. So these are all incredibly important things that will help determine the future of Sanibel and Captiva. And one way for us to help protect this place is to partner with folks like the Center for Coastal Solutions, because we have really, in a sense, joint missions. We are here to take science and create solutions from that science. SCCF is built on that model. The Center for Coastal Solutions is also built on that model, and it's something where we align very closely. And I won't go into too many details about the particulars because you're going to hear from other folks about that. But I do want to thank a few people here, and I want to do something, since it is now past 7 p.m., and just let you all know that our board has unanimously selected Mr. James Evans to replace me in January. It has been a bittersweet decision to leave, but I can't tell you how thrilled I am to leave you in such capable and wonderful hands. This will be just an incredibly important step for SCCF and our islands. I also just want to thank Mayor Holly Smith for being in attendance. Councilman, yes, there you are. I was looking for you. Thank you. Councilman John Henshaw, and the chair of our South Florida Water Management Board, Chauncey Goss. So thank you all for being in attendance, and I don't believe I've missed anyone, and if I have, forgive me. But before we go any further, and I'm going to hand it over to Scott Presley, who is the chair of the advisory committee for the Center for Coastal Solutions, I want to introduce something that I think is incredibly important for our community, that shows just how important this partnership is for the future of our islands and for water quality research generally, because there are truly global implications for what is done here in this partnership. The Pfeiffers, Mary Ellen and Eric, have announced support for this incredibly important partnership through a fellowship that will be called the Pfeiffer Fellowship, alliteration absolutely intentional, where through their generosity over the course of at least the next 5 years, they will support research fellowships to bring researchers to our islands to study issues of particular import to it. So if Mary Ellen and Eric would stand up, if you don't mind. Thank you for your leadership on this. All right, Mr. Presley, Scott Presley, handed to you. Yes, sir. Eric.
All right, so this is fantastic. So thank you for allowing me to introduce our wonderful speaker this evening. I'll be brief. I was 6 years old the first time I came to Sanibel, and my parents brought us here, and we've been coming back ever since. And we actually purchased a condo many years ago through Eric, and now we're looking at building a house and making this more of a permanent home once our senior in high school finally leaves. But we have a huge passion for this island, but it's kind of reflecting back when you say 54 years of the conservation. And we were at Naples 2 nights ago for a dinner, and it's just so different. And not saying bad or making a judgment, but it's very, very different than being on this island. And we got back here and we're like, wow, we're back home. And this is just such a unique and special place that it's absolutely, it touches our hearts, our kids. I mean, this is what they call home. This is where they want a vacation. And so we're so thankful for all the work that SCCF has done over the years. We are super excited, though, to be working now with Christine Angelini, who I'm going to be introducing, and kind of this partnership that we discussed, that how do we make sure we protect this island? And there's so many threats, and one of the things specifically we're focused on is obviously the red tide and a lot of the water quality issues, but making sure that our children and their children are able to just think of Sanibel as this sanctuary, this place that just should remain just as it is today. And so Christine is an associate professor of environmental engineering at UF. She's also the director for the Centers for Coastal Solutions, and that's where I've got to know her over the last several years, is working with her and trying to support her and her team to be successful. She has an undergraduate major in marine biology from Brown University and a PhD in biology, but she is a decorated and productive scientist with over 70 peer-reviewed papers and over 4 million in grants. And all these students that she's working with here and in the past, I've been able through my kind of past to spend time with a lot of really interesting leaders. And I've got to say that Christine has the leadership capability, the drive, the intensity, the competitiveness, and kind of the heart to be able to kind of bring this partnership and really focus on making sure that we protect what we have here. So allow me to introduce Professor Christine Angelini.
All right, good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here, and my love of Sanibel is growing as I've had the opportunity to work here over the last several years and also start to get to know the community and particularly the researchers at the SCCF who I will ride or die with based on sort of, the commitment and the encouragement that they've provided for my students, my staff, my team at the center. And so we're a year into this partnership. I think we signed the memorandum of understanding about a year ago, and I am elated that James is going to be taking the helm. I can't wait for sort of where this partnership is going to go. But we really see this kind of engagement with folks that really know and love this island and know its ecology really well. It's vital for the work that we do, and I'll explain in a little bit more detail about why. But let me start by telling you a little bit about the center that we've started here at the University of Florida. And so you have some context of why Sanibel is such an amazing platform for us to do our work and why this partnership is particularly special for our mission. So our sort of center sprung out of an awareness by leadership at the University of Florida, awareness by myself, that even though we've had some really significant efforts across the state to address water quality hazards, things like red tide and blue-green algae blooms, environmental crises like red tide and large-scale die-off of some of our most cherished ecosystems on the coast, they're continuing to incur with increasing frequency and severity. And what we know is this kind of erosion of what's in the water and what's sort of around us in the water. It's not only degrading the natural beauty of our natural systems, we're literally seeing dead fish and dead birds on our beaches, but it's also harming our public health. It's affecting the days that you go out and walk the beach and you're able to rejuvenate yourself through that experience and stay physically fit. But it's also affecting the economy of our state. I'm sure that you've seen here on Sanibel that people are canceling reservations. They're wary about buying homes here because of this pervasive sort of challenge associated with water quality, and one of the most important examples here is of course, red tide. And so what is the challenge in addressing these water quality hazards? What we know is that there are many institutions that are out trying extremely hard to monitor what the situation is that's going on the ground. So we have the state, the federal government, local entities like the UF-CCS that are collecting large volumes of data on a variety of different things that are going on in our local environment. However, creating sufficient meaning from that data remains a major challenge. We're essentially sitting on piles and mountains of data, but what we do with it and how we use that to inform decisions, that translation of data to action remains a major issue. And this is particularly apparent in coastal areas, exactly where we are right now. And the reason for this is when you're on the coast, you're not only dealing with everything that is happening upstream in the watershed and changes in land use, but all the changes that are happening in our oceans due to climate change, and they collide here at the coastline. So simply the sort of vast interconnectivity and the complex dynamics of the coast making sensible solutions and trying to see through the noise extremely difficult in this particular environment. So what is the Center of Coastal Solutions all about? We are really trying to become the flagship institution, not only in the state of Florida, but also in the nation for providing the intelligence we need for more proactive decision-making in order to prevent coastal water quality hazards in particular. And so how are we gonna do this? I'm going to walk you through our kind of technology ecosystem. Our center is really focused on bringing the best of University of Florida to the table to meet this challenge and bring forth this solution. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what kind of is under the hood of our technology and data-driven sort of ecosystem. So there's a lot of kind of things on this slide. So what I'd like to kind of bring your attention to is that what we are doing right now is trying to harness the large amounts of data that are out there by bringing together a really sophisticated data intake pipeline. So we are essentially vacuuming ocean data, we're vacuuming watershed data, we're compiling that and aggregating it into really clean and efficient to use databases. We're fusing that data together from different sources using some advanced algorithms that are coming from our computer science department, and we're coupling all this data to Earth system models. And what this allows us to do, this kind of fusion of all this data and all these models, is create what we're calling a digital twin of coastal waters. Don't worry if you're getting a little bit lost. I'm going to give an example of what this looks like in Charlotte Harbor. But what I want you to know is that we are building a basic technology ecosystem, and we're pilot testing it in your waterway. And what it's going to deliver for you are maps and forecasts of changing water quality in space and time. It's going to give you an opportunity to optimize the decisions that your island and the surrounding counties and the state can make related to how do we fix the water quality challenges that we're facing. It allows you to sort of achieve policy and intervention guidance and where do we place investments and how much. And finally, the kind of crux of this from my perspective as a scientist is that this is a platform for making major scientific discoveries about what is the relationship between how our waterways are changing and how that affects people, our environment, and our economy. And so there's a variety of different users for this, but what I want you to know is we are building a basic capability with our with our center that is meant to service all of these different users, and we're building it sort of in your backyard to pilot test something that we hope to expand elsewhere. And this kind of technology to solutions ecosystem is really powered by a diverse and deep bench of talent. This is coming across multiple colleges, across the College of Engineering, and I'll make a few comments about that later. But also it requires exceptional supercomputing power. These are large amounts of data. These Earth system models are really intensive in terms of their computational needs. And we have now one of the fastest supercomputers into higher education, among the top 5 fastest supercomputers in the world. And this came to the University of Florida in the last 2 years through a major investment through one of our donors to help us stand up this kind of incredible supercomputing power. And finally, it's coming from our unrivaled and sort of unmatched and really powerful public-private partnerships, including the one that we have here with the UF-CCS. So this has really stood up. This is the sort of foundational needs that are supporting our ability to build this technology. So let me tell you about what you care about, which is what's happening in your backyard and in the waterways here. So, and allowing you to kind of digest how will coastal communities, ecosystems, and economies, including yours, benefit from our ability to build this kind of digital twin of coastal waters. So as you are probably all very acutely aware, Charlotte Harbor is a region that is being affected and is experiencing frequent and diverse and a variety of damaging water quality challenges. And so you may be seeing this on your boats and in your backyard or on the beaches in the form of red tide. You may be seeing it in the form of hypoxia or low oxygen areas that are causing massive fish kills. And this is work that Eric has really led here out of the SCCF. Or you may be driving through kind of clogged navigation channels that are sort of affected by large blooms of macroalgae. And so there's kind of a cascade of a variety of different water quality challenges that you're facing right here in your backyard. And they look different kind of on any different day of the week or every year or every season. So the kind of what you're facing as a community and as a broader region is where and what kind of action should be taken to redirect the kind of Charlotte Harbor's trajectory from one which is kind of chronically affected by water quality hazards to one where you're on a route to recovery. How do you turn the system around? How do you start to improve the sort of trajectory of your system to one where you feel like you're in control of the situation and things are actually improving? So this is a complex challenge. Answering that question is not easy. People have been working on it for decades, as long as the SDCF has been around. And this is because where you're sitting is at the base of 7 large watersheds. We have the Myakka and the Peace rivers that are draining into Charlotte Harbor from the north. You have the Caloosahatchee River that's draining kind of directly from the east into this system. And really resolving where in the upstream system should we be addressing water quality challenges. That is a difficult task when you're dealing with basically a local system that's affected by kind of almost 20% of the landmass of Florida drains into your local harbors. And the reason why sort of answering this question currently is partly the spatial scope of this system. But it's also really difficult to do from a technical perspective, and this is because the data that we have available about what's happening in this watershed and what's happening in our ocean, our local oceans, is disseminated across a variety of different databases right now. We don't have a single place to gather all the data about what's happening in the watershed, what's happening in the estuary, and what's happening in the ocean. And in a very similar way, the models that we have about how the system physically behaves and chemically behaves and ecologically behaves are broken up into many small pieces. We have local models for smaller chunks of this overall system, but those don't feed into a larger whole. And so, basically, in order to get to kind of a more proactive solutions mindset and how do we kind of turn the trajectory around for this system, we can't quite get there, I would say, largely because we have so much uncertainty about what policy changes we should make, what type of infrastructure investments should we make. The city of Captiva right now is struggling with, should they convert from septic to sewer? This is happening to your neighbors just to the north. And what will the benefits of that be? And different types of management actions. Basically, we have a variety of different approaches we can take to start to address and put Band-Aids on this problem. But will they actually achieve the desired water quality improvements that we're really seeking? And so I think this kind of uncertainty stifles our ability to do big collective actions that actually solve the problems at the scales we need and the scales you particularly need at the sort of the base of all of these upstream challenges to receive the benefits that you really seek. So what I would say is to improve conditions, we have to first and foremost resolve where the nutrient pollution to your system in particular is coming from. We know that nitrogen and phosphorus pollution coming into your system is at levels that exceed what's acceptable. The waterways behind you just got all assigned to being impaired. And what we need to kind of resolve where the nutrient pollution is coming from is we need a really kind of a whole system scale analysis. Which one of these 7 watersheds are contributing most to the nutrient pollution that you're seeing in Charlotte Harbor? And on a more granular scale, within each one of those watersheds, which you see sort of delineated by these darker lines here, what are the land use types? What are the sort of actions that humans are making on the landscape that are contributing most to sort of nutrient pollution? Is it our urban areas? Is it our agricultural areas? Is it our cattle farms that are upstream? Which ones are contributing most to our nutrient pollution problems? And sort of once we have those identified, we then need to start to simulate what's the relative return on investment in different solutions to stem these nutrients at their source and ultimately allow Sanibel to not be sort of an area that's dotted with large volumes of red tide all the time, sort of fueled by these blooms. So to get here, what we really need, this is a big data Earth system modeling sort of need. You need something that can encapsulate all of this large spatial scale, all the complexity of the system from the watershed to the ocean. And this is really why we're building this digital twin technology for your system. And it has to be guided by the diverse expertise we need for this system to work correctly. But it also has to be run on a state-of-the-art supercomputer, because this is not something that you can do on your laptop. This is a big data supercomputing kind of challenge. And so this is why I think the University of Florida is a great partner with those of you who are working locally and know these waters and know these systems and know the stakeholders well, to really build this technology right. So in our year since our founding, what we've been doing to sort of make headway in building this digital twin technology is we've been building this data intake pipeline. We now have a sort of management system. This is actually outdated. This is where just a small subsection of where our data was coming from 10 months ago. We now have data that lights up that entire 7 watershed region that's draining into the Charlotte Harbor area. Over 600 million records of water quality records coming into our data management system that are coming from the watershed, the estuary, and the ocean. And this is being supported. We're adopting and integrating all the data that's coming off of the UF-CCS's Recon network. This is a vital part of our data management system and the information that we're gathering about what's happening day in and day out in your watershed. We've also been building this Earth system model. It's validated. It's performing extremely well for this region that you see highlighted in this map. And it's not only producing 3D maps of sort of changes in water quality, it's allowing us to reconstruct historic events, and it's operating in a forecasting mood to project changes in circulation over time in your local system. So these are kind of our foundational elements. And we've been beginning to make this translation of how do we take what we're learning within our center out into policy. There's not direct relation between what we're building with our digital twins and the coastal policy work that we're really here to talk about, but that's underway. And we're starting to think about how do we make that leap. And I think insights from James and others here at SCCF are really vital for thinking about how do we push levers based on what we're learning. So SCCF is a vital partner in this technology. As I mentioned, the Recon network that you've invested in is delivering access to outstanding real-time water quality data. This is vital for the work that we do. It's got a great spatial coverage. The fact that it's real-time, this is why we came to Sanibel, is because we had access to this network. So that investment in this ecosystem is why UF realized that this is the place to do our work. The scientists on your staff are providing just outstanding expertise in chemistry and biology and physics, and how to work in these local waterways. So Eric, this is an example of Eric sort of walking us through your cytocam and what you learn about phytoplankton. The Marine Lab itself is providing outstanding equipment and logistical support for all of our field operations. My PhD student, Colin, who I wish I was here tonight, his work has been stood up by the SCCF staff and the Marine Lab. And more generally, your staff is educating us about what's happening on the ground regarding policy challenges and connecting us to local stakeholders in ways that are just vital for us. We're sitting up in Gainesville. We want to come and make a difference, but we can't do that without kind of local action and local connections. More broadly, we have just an outstanding team sitting behind us. So our center we have over 20 affiliate faculty that are working directly on these challenges. We have 30 affiliate faculty that are spread across campus. This is sort of a dream team. I feel really lucky to be directing a center that's supported by such a talented group. Similarly, we have an advisory board that Scott's been just an outstanding advisory board sort of chairman and helped us sort of assemble this group. But we have folks from the private sector that know how to help us kind of integrate and engage the private sector. We have folks from NGOs that are providing vital guidance on how we better interface with the NGO sector, including Heather Barron, who many of you know locally from Crow. She's just an outstanding person for us to have on our board. Folks from the government and private sector. And finally, we're represented by and advised by a broad group across the University of Florida campus that's allowing us to tap into different types of resources. So just know that what I'm talking about is kind of there's an infrastructure and an engine behind it that is the people and the talent that we have. And some amazing partnerships that sort of are across the board that are either providing data, allowing us to translate our science into action. All right, so what I want to sort of end with is just a couple of highlights of what we've learned over the last year of our research working with the SCCF. So we started work really we formalized the partnership, as I said, a year ago. And so we got hustling to start standing up some research. So this is a the first time I've given an overview of what we've learned in this last year. So bear with me if it's not totally polished. But what I want you to know is we were able to do some really meaningful work. It changed the lives of our PhD students, our postdocs, and the faculty that have worked on this work. And so here's some of the things that we learned. So we had an interest in understanding whether the nutrients and the flows that are coming out of the Caloosahatchee River and discharging into Charlotte Harbor were possibly fueling red tide blooms in this region. So the sort of overarching question underpinning this particular study is, do nutrient-enriched river discharges coming from the Caloosahatchee, draining from Lake Okeechobee, are they actually facilitating red tide? And if so, does this nutrient influence not only extend all the way up to Lake Okeechobee, but does it also extend up to the Kissimmee River Basin? And this is a really important sort of type of study to do because it allows us to say whether you need to fix the nutrient problems simply within the Caloosahatchee River watershed, do we need to fix them in the lake, or do we need to fix them all the way up into the Kissimmee River Basin? And so I'm not going to get into the methods, but just so you know, it looks something like this. So I have a really talented statistician on our team, Miles Medina. Let me tell you, this squiggle has a lot of meaning in it, and this is what science looks like these days. But I can get into what that means and talk to me afterwards, but I won't talk about it. But basically, I feel really confident that we were getting some amazing findings. So here's some of the things that we learned about the relationship between the Caloosahatchee River and the red tide that you're seeing in your backyard. First and foremost, the nitrogen that's coming in our nutrient is sort of in the discharges from the lake, flooding down the Caloosahatchee River into your backyard, we find evidence that they're consistently facilitating seasonal red tide blooms in this period spanning 2012 to 2021. So for about this 10-year period for which we have sufficient amounts of data, nitrogen from that watershed is fueling the blooms. What this means is that the blooms are getting worse because of those sort of discharges. Interesting, the volume of water that's coming down the Caloosahatchee, those effects of that discharge are strongest when the red tide blooms are sort of still in their infancies. So the discharges themselves are fueling early bloom growth. And then this gets catapulted when you have nitrogen added into the system. And essentially what we're finding is that the nitrogen signal in the system sustains the blooms that are there. Okay? All right, oops, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. And we can trace this nitrogen signal that's fueling the blooms not only up to the Lake Okeechobee, but we can trace it back up into the Kissimmee River Basin as well. And what this suggests is that comprehensive watershed scale nutrient management may be needed ultimately for you to achieve the desired outcomes that you really want in terms of reductions in red tide. Band-aids across that entire system are going to be beneficial, but it may need to extend as far north, and we may need to be advocating for discharges as far north as Kissimmee River to really sort of reduce the severity and duration of red tide blooms. And so what we're doing next in this work is resolving which of the kind of more, we call them sub-basins, but the smaller regions within these watersheds that we know are contributing to nutrient pollution, which ones are relatively more important, and that way we can provide more targeted guidance on what parts of the watersheds are the real pressure points and should be prioritized most for nutrient management. Another thing that we've been doing is working on advancing our ability to detect red tide. This is being led by a student who's just an outstanding computer scientist. He sometimes gets out to fish, but mostly he's behind a computer writing code. But what he's been able to do is dramatically improve our ability to detect red tide accurately. You may all use different apps for detecting red tide, but what we can tell you is on average, we're outperforming those existing tools you have on your computer or on your phone by about 20%. And we're doing this by using some advanced artificial intelligence capabilities. And this is a reconstruction of the red tide bloom that occurred in 2018 based on our red tide algorithm. And what you can just see is this bloom swashing up and down the coast. Kind of calming down in this right now. This is the dates kind of ticking up, so in the winter months, and you're going to see it sort of kick up again over time as this progresses. But this is giving us not only really powerful insights on where red tide actually is, and that can support not only mitigation, but also communication with the public, but also where we go out and study these kind of phenomenon. But it's also giving amazing insights about what the dynamics of these blooms actually are in space and time, and how they fluctuate across the coast. And so some of the next steps in this work are that we're going to be kind of reconstructing historic red tide events and forecasting future ones by coupling this to our Earth system model, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. We're going to be resolving how confident we are in these models using some really advanced artificial intelligence kind of model validation techniques to really detect whether are we as accurate as we think we are, and so we're going to really kind of put our capabilities to the test in that regard. And probably most relevant to all of you is that we're coupling these red tide detection algorithms to what the economic outcomes are for different economic sectors. So when you have particularly long or severe red tide in close proximity to some of your properties, your locations, what is the relative impact to the hospitality sector, to the housing sector, to restaurants, to commercial fishing, and we can develop that, basically that capability with one of our collaborations with an economist at the University of Florida, and we are on fast track to sort of making that progress this next year. One of my favorite things to talk about is basically is a project that Eric and Heather Barron from Crow and my student Kim Prince, who's in the crowd tonight, and folks from FWC worked on to understand whether we can leverage the outstanding data that Crow has been collecting for the last several decades on shorebird admissions related to sort of exposure to brevetoxin, which is produced by red tide, whether we can use the intake of those birds as an early warning sign for impending red tide. And so we've been doing some collaborative work to collect shorebird and prey fish during sort of an early bloom, sort of a reemergence of a bloom in 2021, so just about 10 months ago. And we've been analyzing these samples for what we call their stable isotopes, which tells us about what those animals have been eating, as well as their brevetoxin levels. And what this study is going to advance our understanding of is what birds are eating in our local waterways, and which of their prey that they're eating are contributing to their brevetoxin poisoning. So what are the kind of feeding linkages that are leading to these birds getting as sick as they are? Does those feeding relationships differ between immature and mature birds? And we have particular interest in this because immature cormorants seem to come in and be the ultimate sentinels, is Heather's perspective, because we think that they're eating different things during these the early onset of these blooms. And so what we're really going to be able to uncover is whether certain species that are kind of admitted into our wildlife hospitals, they can allow us to sort of understand when red tide is going to hit us, and that will not only support our ability to go better monitor those events, but also begin to mitigate them. So these are just some of Kim's early sort of food web data showing sort of some of our stable isotope data that we will be using to illuminate basically what birds are eating essentially in this system in a variety of different species. And this has been a really exciting collaboration with a couple of entities in your county. Okay, I promise I just have a couple of more, but they're exciting and interesting. So bear with me. All right, so we have also been working on the physics and how water sort of sloshes through Charlotte Harbor, and this has been work that's led by one of our postdocs, Lu-Ming Shi, and one of our faculty members, Maitani Olabarrieta, who's a physical oceanographer. And what we're trying to understand is basically how much does the volume of water that's shunting out of the Caloosahatchee affect how the tide waters move through Charlotte Harbor? So essentially, does the tide get sort of shuffled around or distorted based on how much water is coming out of the Caloosahatchee? And so I'll explain this, sort of the rationale for this is that there's huge fluctuations in how much the sort of Caloosahatchee River discharges into Charlotte Harbor. It can range from sort of really basically the river being literally a trickle to up to 800 cubic meters per second, which is kind of a slug of water coming down the Caloosahatchee. So what we want to know is how does that affect basically mixing with ocean water? And so we've done some really nice physical models of this system on this kind of panel here. You can see what the salinity dynamics are, which kind of tells you a little bit about freshwater and saltwater mixing during a low river discharge regime and when there's lots of water coming out of the Caloosahatchee. And generally what we found is this really fascinating phenomenon. You guys may be losing me a little bit here, but just bear with me, it's really cool, is that when we have large volumes of water, essentially the tide can't fight it and it gets stopped. Essentially, it's like a plug up the Caloosahatchee River. And so you do not have the tide sort of attenuating up the Caloosahatchee when you have large volumes of water. And what this ends up doing is it exacerbates what our tidal currents are in the lower estuary, so around the base of Sanibel. And this has huge implications for when we have events like red tide, whether those get brought into the estuary and trapped behind you, or whether they stay in the offshore. So this is this kind of physical understanding of how the rivers push against the ocean has critical consequences ultimately for how long nutrient-rich water sits here, whether it fuels red tide, and whether we get red tide that's in the offshore and it gets sucked into the back estuary. So anyway, all this physical work may seem really kind of complex, but it's illuminating some really powerful things about the physical dynamics of your system. And so we are going to be working on linking this model more comprehensively to what's going on in the watershed in terms of the flows and the nutrient delivery. And Eric will talk about this in this kind of new collaboration that we have. All right, just a few more slides. If you care about Mount Lachey Pass, which is a really amazing area, so you can see it down here. It's a fascinating location in your backyard because this is where we have a very interesting confluence between the rivers that are coming from the north, the Peace and Mayaka, and the Caloosahatchee, and what goes on with water quality right here in this inflection point in Mount Lachey is really complex. And what we know is that this is a location within your broader watershed that's experiencing a lot of water quality challenges and degradation in the ecosystem. And so we're trying to understand what are the physical forces that control basically the water quality in this pass, and ultimately the rates and directions at which this pass flushes. And so this has been work we've done really collaboratively with UF-CCS. A couple of you guys that are here have driven boats for us for these long 25-hour deployments, which are really long, but just know that we've done really comprehensive analysis all across this pass. We've had water quality stations out for several months, and right now we're processing all of this data. And this is just a quick snapshot of what we're finding is that when we have spring tides, so in relatively higher stages, this is a sort of a schematic showing generally what direction the water is flowing on average across those periods of time and what the water surface elevation gradients look like. And in contrast, when we have lower or neap tides, so the tidal stage is relatively lower, we get totally different dynamics, kind of sloshing water up and down through sort of Caloosahatchee. So this is just a sneak peek of what we're going to get out, but we're really going to be able to, I think, make some major progress in resolving the water quality dynamics in the system. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric. I'm sure you've done sort of listening to me, but to talk about essentially where this work is going in collaboration with the SCCF through a really outstanding project that he's been a critical part of that's being sponsored by the Army Corps of Engineers, their Engineering Research and Development Center, to continue to support our collaboration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks to Scott and the Pfeiffers for really helping to make this collaboration flourish. Been really impressed with being able to work with Christine and her colleagues at UF, and feel like we're really stepping up our level of intellectual capital, helping us on the island. So I'm going to be fairly brief. I'm just going to tell you about one of the projects that Christine had touched on that's really taken off on a life of its own, and it's really kind of trying to figure out these flows from the lake, flows from the watershed, what's causing algae blooms. And we're really not just focused on freshwater, we're focused on the entire continuum from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Lake Okeechobee. So I probably don't need to give you much introduction to this, but we have a problem with nutrients, and our warm water really creates conditions that are conducive to algae blooms, especially these microscopic cyanobacteria. They are harmful to humans, they're harmful to pets, and they cause widespread ecological problems. And part of the issue with 2018 is there was a massive bloom occurring in April and May in Lake Okeechobee, and that water was flushed towards the estuary in large volumes and created a bloom that really lasted for several months and clogged up canals and was a total guacamole nightmare. At the same time, you remember the worst red tide in memory and more dead fish even than 2005. And this is from red tide, and Christine talked a lot about red tide, and they do initiate offshore, probably naturally, transported to near shore, and then they're being fueled by the conditions that are there, whether it's the physical combined with the nutrients that we have excess of. And the ecosystems that are just suffering, and one of the reasons we had so many dead fish in 2018 is this massive hypoxic zone. So we think that the red tide was intense, yes, and it killed a lot of fish, yes, but what happens when you kill a lot of fish is oxygen just gets used up by all the bacteria and fungi and everything else in the water. And then on top of that, the water column became stratified, so there was not any mixing between the lower levels and the upper levels. The upper level was doing okay because it was mixing with the air. Lower levels were completely void of oxygen. The levels were lower than we've ever measured, and a lot of other people too. And it's kind of an unprecedented thing for this area, but in doing a little more research, we found a few other events since 1970 where this has occurred. But we had so many dead fish because of this large hypoxic area, 600 square kilometers. So I don't need to talk about this. I think Christine did a nice job about explaining why poor water quality is hurting our economy. But one of the things that we've always been working on, we know that big projects in the Everglades for storage of water and for distribution of water that are coming through the Everglades, Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, will give us many benefits. However, the way that the system is engineered currently, because of changes in the past, there's a lot of different complications. Places where water can go and be stored, places to get rid of water, and so on. So we feel like there are solutions that we can find through flexibility in management of water. So our sort of solution in 2007 was, okay, well, let's start collecting a lot of data. We can bring this data forward to the Water Management District and the Corps of Engineers and at least tell them about the condition of the estuary. And having a high-frequency data collection gives you a lot of power to talk about events. So whether it's a rainfall event, a cold front, or any type of event that's sort of short-lived. The unfortunate thing is most water quality programs were really focused on monthly sampling. So you miss a lot of events that were occurring in the estuary. Sort of later, it was much later, but in 2018, spurred by this crisis that we were having, we were able to get an award, and I met some great colleagues at UF and NC State to start systematically sampling algae, microscopic algae that lives in the water column. And those again were investigations to look at the connection between the discharges from the watershed and the lake, and whether we could sort of tease those apart. And that parlayed into an extension through the EPA that will be going on through 2024. That'll be again a systematic monthly sampling, which had not occurred in this estuary prior. So part of the leverage that we used, and I can't take much credit for this other than being in discussions, but David Kaplan at UF is leading an effort to really combine all of our observational data with the modeling expertise that is housed up at UF. So we're going to try and answer questions such as, can we target the discharges during less ecologically vulnerable periods? Can the Lachey releases be scheduled to flush out harmful algae blooms potentially? And again, back to this question, are there specific nutrient sources or places that are fueling some of the harmful algae blooms? And there's a whole team of people, and hopefully you'll get to meet them or hear from them over the course of the next several years. But the Corps of Engineers have invested in this effort, and we're just kicking it off really in November. We sampled for the first time, so we're very excited about that. Christine talked about the data synthesis and really trying to make better sense of the information that we have. But the coupled modeled approach is something that on a small barrier island with the 6 marine lab staff that we have and assorted other scientists, we don't have the modeling expertise here. So we're so thankful to be able to bring that aboard, where we have Mauricio Arias, who has a Lake Okeechobee nutrient model that will help us figure out how many nutrients are coming out at any given time during the releases that occur. That will be coupled to a watershed model, which is basically looking at land uses and figuring out, okay, well, how much water is flowing through there, and then how many nutrients are in that water that will eventually end up on our backyard or in the Gulf of Mexico. And finally, the bottom end of this is an ocean forcing model. So from the Gulf of Mexico, sort of trying to predict the kinds of relationships that Christine had mentioned. When there's high flows, we push back the tide, and so we then just have water flushing out the top and pushing away. Essentially, we're turning the Gulf of Mexico around Sanibel into the estuary, so there's implications ecologically for that. So here are expected outcomes. I know this is not a results talk. I'm glad Christine had some results in her talk, but I'm very excited to kick this off with this team. And again, we're going to try and connect the flows from the lake and the watershed to phytoplankton dynamics. So when they're present, when they're blooming, when they're absent. We're going to look for drivers of those blooms, whether those are specific nutrients from a certain place, those sorts of things. And then also try and provide a model that's general and that will help us optimize the Lachey discharges. And we're going to have to at some point address the watershed because it is actually has a higher pollutants than some of the lake discharges do. So can we feed those outcomes into increased operational flexibility is a term the Corps likes to use, but also in future iterations of the operation schedule that we're just sort of getting to a new schedule which will be beneficial to us thanks to James and Paul Julian and Holly Smith and many others in this room have been working to help that for our coast. So I am finished with my briefing. Well,
okay, we have only one more slide. Okay, so I'm happy to introduce Tom Akerson to talk a little bit about why we're specifically here right now. And this is and so I'll give him the stage. Tom is a professor in our law school. It's been a real pleasure of my life, I guess, to have an opportunity to work with Tom, and because the vast experience that he brings to the table. But I'll let him take it off from here and allow us to all take a breath from presentation. So Tom, take it away.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks, Eric, for all of that as well, and Christine. That's science, and boy, that's deep science. One of the mottos, though, of the center is science to policy, and we're working to do that, and one of the ways we're working to do that in the center is by engaging students in the enterprise, which we're a university, and that's what we should be doing. So we've created this project we call the Coastal Policy Lab, which is a partnership between the law school and the engineering school, with Christine and I as the professors, and we have 12 students, 6 of whom are engineering or science students, and 6 of whom are law students. So it's a deliberate, intentional model to bring them together, and then to do it in an experiential fashion so that those students work together in teams, scientists and lawyers, on specific projects. And so we came down here and began working with Ryan and Eric and talked about some things that we could perhaps help out with here with research and that expertise, and bring the science and policy together. And so we'll be doing that tomorrow. Actually, we have 2 more hours of presentations tonight. We'll be doing that tomorrow right here, I understand, right? Yes. Yeah, we're doing that tomorrow right here, and our students will be presenting. I wonder if they'd all stand up just so you could see them. For a moment there, we thought they were going to be the audience, but thank you all for coming. So we have 5 projects, 4.5 perhaps is a better term for it, that we've been working on all semester that will roll out tomorrow, and the students will be doing all of the presenting. One of which involves looking at the Sanibel plan, its comprehensive plan, which is unique to any plans that I've worked on. I've worked on many, and how to better integrate sea level rise, climate change and particularly sea level rise, into that plan. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We've been looking at the Mangrove Protection Act. It's a very complicated statute, and we'll spend some time going through that and perhaps some ideas for how that act could better serve its purposes. The interior canals here, we've been looking at that in terms of how to improve the water quality there, because, you know, like it or not, you are also part of the problem here at Sanibel. There's some interesting ideas about what you can do literally in your backyards to enhance the quality of that water and what that might look like as well through some nature-based solutions. We've also been looking to the island to the north with the Captiva Erosion Protection District at what its charge is as a statutory matter, as a legal matter, and whether it is sufficiently broad to enable it to do some things in the Back Bay in particular, where there's a lot of interest there that would enhance the resiliency of that island. And then finally, we were today on a boat with the West Coast Inland Navigation District looking at a particular channel that they've had to dredge over and over and over again. And the idea there is to determine the extent to which a different dredging template might enhance the ability to dredge not so often, and then how you will make that happen as a matter of law, where now it's so easy to dredge because you have an exemption because you're doing maintenance dredging rather than having to get a whole new permit and so forth. So that was an interesting discussion. Those students already presented, and that will be it. So you're all welcome to come and ask questions of these guys. They have all the answers, I can promise you. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, we do have time for questions, but I do want you all to remember this, because I'm quite confident of this. In 3 to 5 years, we're going to look back and say, wow, that was something special we saw at the beginning. And I'm really confident of that. This is just absolutely incredible work. I think this will probably make it one of the most studied regions on the planet, and in a good way, in a really great way. So I do have a microphone here. If you do have questions, I don't know why I didn't take the stairs, but if we have a question, I'm happy to ask. Surely you didn't understand all of that.
Christine? When you listed when you had the list of the environmental impacts for Charlotte Harbor, was that list ranked in terms of I think the first one you had was fertilizer influence. Were they ranked in terms of how influential they were, or was it just
Yeah.
a list?
That's a great question. We're striving to get to that list. I love that Chauncey's here on the call, and I really love to hear his input on some of this and whether a lot of that in some of these watersheds has really been done already. But how do we look at this kind of systematically and think about those priorities at a whole system scale and think about what is a policy action, what's a management action, what's an infrastructure investment, and try to prioritize those different types of actions across the whole system. So no, they were not ranked, and this is something that I know the water management districts is part of their charge. So it's really, I want to use this as an opportunity to extend an olive branch and try to basically start this conversation with the water management districts too. But no, so briefly no, but that's really where we're striving to go on a whole system level.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of things. It was pointed out a couple of times tonight that we're looking at the impact of the various potential sources of nutrients and water flow and temperature gradients, et cetera, that they use the word fuel the red tides that are beginning elsewhere. Is there much looking at what starts the red tides? Because like with a fire, you can have a spark, but if you don't have oxygen, you have to have all components to come together. So is there anything being done to look at what causes it to start? Because if it doesn't start, then you really can't fuel it.
Sure. Yeah, so a majority of the research on red tide has been on that question. And so we know more about the initiation of the bloom than we do about how the blooms end. So there's a certain type of ocean current condition that occurs with a current called the loop current. And we think there may be a spore of some sort in the life history of Karenia brevis, the dinoflagellate, because the blooms seem to appear in the same places, and then they're transported on shore. So we've only been able, being science, I'm not speaking about me or Christine's lab, but science has really only been able to capture that a few different times in the last 30 or 40 years, but a lot of the research dollars goes towards that question. And when you bring them into the lab, they behave a certain way. They don't always behave that way in a complex ocean environment. But would you agree that the initiation is probably better understood than what happens when it comes on?
Yeah, to some degree, yeah. I mean, there's additional work that's being done to understand basically whether to really start to map what's going on the subsurface. You know, we are much better at tracking red tide once it's off the surface. We can see it from remote sensing. People see it on their boats, and we are able to start to sort of monitor it at that point. But it's certainly something that starts as a subsurface kind of phenomenon. But what's happening under the surface and exactly where it blooms from, there's consistency that it's coming from offshore and coming inshore. But I think that some of what's hopefully we'll be able to better understand with improved circulation of what's happening on the coast is just some of those cells just get entrained and kept at shore, and under certain conditions what continues to sort of float around is able to sort of bloom up. So I think this is basically an outstanding debate right now about how much is there this kind of consistent cycle where it starts offshore and then it comes onshore and then eventually it ends, versus there's lingering cells and those can get kind of jump-started again once they're here. So I feel like the huge effort going into improving sort of the spatial coverage of a lot of the monitoring, and FWC is really leading a lot of that, but I would say we don't have a nail in the coffin. This is such a complex system, and these are really large spatial scales we're talking about, and really small cells. So it's not an easy thing to do, even with where we are with kind of state-of-the-art science. Yep.
Great, thanks. I would like to introduce Don Rice, the president of our board, who has a question.
Christine, you mentioned Charlotte Harbor rather regularly in your presentation. As a boater, who stores his boat up in Moorhaven and watches the Caloosahatchee and sees Pine Island Sound and the San Carlos Bay. Around Sanibel, we think about those as the influence of the Caloosahatchee. So how is it, if we're going to market this to people about Charlotte Harbor, how is it at Charlotte Harbor affects the southern part of Pine Island Sound and San Carlos Bay?
Sure, that's a really good question. And so we have considerably better data about what's going on in the Caloosahatchee, partly because of recon, partly because of a lot of interest in the Lachey discharges, relative to sort of what's coming in from the north, from the Peace and Myakka rivers and sort of other sort of smaller watersheds that are coming into the system. I can tell you that Charlotte Harbor is investing now in improving their water quality capabilities, so we're hoping relatively soon to have higher resolution and in space and time in terms of the water quality data that we have from the north. We're doing the best we can with the sort of scraping of data that we have access to, but it's not at the level of sophistication of the south. So we do fully consider it a fully dynamic and coupled system. I mean, certainly from what we're understanding with Matt Lachey, water from the Caloosahatchee squirts up north sometimes and gets up into the northern parts of the bay, and under other conditions, it's very likely that water from the Peace and Myakka are coming down and getting into the southern part of the bay. It's not sort of a totally distinct coupled system. So I think there's a lot more work that we need to do, and some continues to be some data needs that we have. But yeah, as somebody not local to this region, and Eric's actually commented on this, we call it Charlotte Harbor, but no one locally does. So this is what you get when folks from Gainesville come down and start to work in your backyard.
Right. Well, thank you all so much. Great to see you in person again, honestly. It's a pleasure.